Hank Green, this video is for you, my dude, on behalf of knitters around the world. If you're not Hank Green, maybe give him a tag in the comments. Now, Hank Green and SciShow put out a YouTube video a couple of days ago entitled, "Physicists Don't Understand Why Knitting Works." Now, Hank, I know that you're getting taken to church in the comments of that YouTube video. Folks are discheesed with you. Let's put it that way. As somebody who is a scientist by training and has also been an avid knitter for 27 years, I want to take a couple of seconds and discuss a few points in your video, because I think you really do a tremendous disservice to the science, the art, and the craft of knitting, and to the labor, skill, creativity, and expertise of generations of predominantly women who, through their invention and engineering of the art and science of knitting, have not only transformed entire societies, clothed millions of people, but have also made significant historical, societal, economic, and scientific contributions along the way. I don't think that your video was malicious, but I think it was ill-conceived, riddled with errors. I really want to offer this as a critique so that maybe you can make a follow-up video correcting your mistakes. Allow me to draw attention to a couple of segments of your 10-minute video.
Objects in the world is a sock that's about 800 years old. It was a simple thing, a pattern of knots in the shape of a cylinder with a bend toward the end for the heel.
Unfortunately, you've got a number of errors here right at the beginning of your video. It's actually unclear initially here what sock you're referencing. You say 800 or 900 years old. That leads me to believe that you're thinking about a very famous blue and white cotton sock from ancient Egypt, dated about 1100 CE. It's an extremely intricate garment made by an obviously incredibly skilled knitter. But then you go on to describe knitting as a series of knots. And later in the video, you refer to that sock as having a split toe, which leads me to think that you're not actually talking about that blue and white knitted sock. I believe, based on multiple statements you made throughout the video, that you're actually referencing a far older pair of socks, 250 to 450 CE. They are red with split toes. They're in the Victoria and Albert Museum. You see, you described knitting as a series of knots, but it's not at all. Knitting is a series of interconnected loops. As any knitter who has had to frog their project can tell you, knitting is not knots. You pull the end of the yarn and you can unravel the whole darn thing because it's just interconnected loops. The socks you are referencing are null binding, which is a craft that is far older than knitting. It's thousands of years old. Null binding is an ancient craft that is done with a needle and yarn, and it is a series of knots. The oldest known textile fragment of null binding is more than 8,000 years old. So right off the bat in this video, you don't accurately describe what knitting is, and then you reference a garment that was not knitted.
Now, perhaps knitting doesn't fill you to the brim with excitement. I get this, but...
Hank, why did you say this? You just alienated all of the knitters in your audience. Why would you frame this entire video from a defensive position of knitting is boring? And I'm going to try and convince you that it's cool. Or at least that physicists are using it to do something cool. Because, knitting itself obviously not cool. Like, I don't understand this framing.
Fabrics. It's actually a little like programming, but with yarn.
It is programming. It is programming with yarn. Now, I realize you are focusing on the engineering and science aspects of knitting and not the historical aspects, but considering the moment in history that we're going through right now, speaking of knitting as programming, you had a chance to talk about how knitting has been used multiple times in history as a form of resistance against authoritarians, against tyrants. For example, in World War I, women in Belgium, they would knit code into fabrics. I know you went on to say that all knitting is a series of either knit or purl stitches, and that's simply not true. I mean, we can just look at code knitters throughout history and how yarn overs have been really important for communicating, relaying messages in knitted fabric during wartime. Across multiple countries in World War II, women were employed as spies, knitting coded messages. And as long as we're talking about knitting as resistance in the American Revolution, Molly Old Mom Riker was a famous spy for George Washington. She would sneak messages in her balls of yarn. I mean, knitting and programming go hand in hand. Dewey Decimal System, Morse code, computer binary languages. You can turn those into textiles because of the unique characteristics of knitting as a series of interconnected loops and the various stitches that you can employ. And speaking of stitches, again, you went on to say that there are basically only two stitches to knitting and purling. Purling is actually just knitting on the back side of the garment. They're the same stitches in reverse. You then went on to talk about stockinette stitch, but unfortunately, and I know people in your comments corrected you, you got a lot of feedback about it. You talked about stockinette stitch and then showed an image that is actually reverse stockinette. Again, I really wish you had talked to knitters or consulted knitters before you put this piece together. Because we notice, and if you're trying to educate other people, why not strive for accuracy? You have a scientific YouTube channel, why not strive for accuracy when discussing knitting? I want to get into the little bit of like academic bias and snobbery that happens later in this video, but for right now, let me just say there are so many experts who have advanced degrees, both in terms of knitting as textile construction, gobs of knitwear designers, but also like historians who have MFAs and PhDs, specifically around knitting and commerce, knitting and history, knitting and resistance, knitting and the invisible labor of women.
Happens because wherever two pieces of yarn cross each other, each one wants to be in the same spot, but they cannot be. So one strand gets pushed down while the other gets pushed up. And each section of the yarn naturally resists being bent and stretched around the other, so the strand that's being pushed down reacts with a small upward force, and the strand that's being pushed up creates a downward force. Ultimately, the yarn settles into the position where it's under the least amount of tension. In other words, it relaxes into the lowest possible energy configuration, just like a ball coming to rest at the bottom of a driveway. That's why once you have made your stitches, you can stretch out the fabric however you want, but the tension in the fabric will generally pull it back into its original shape. And usually that original shape is not perfectly flat.
This looks pretty flat to me. Also, you failed to take into account here the fact that knitters understand the forces in the yarn that we're knitting. In this video, you repeatedly referred to yarn as string. Those are two different things. And if you talk to spinners, such as myself, the forces that you exert on the raw fiber when you are spinning, the direction you choose to spin, how you ply your yarn, that all impacts the ultimate torque, elasticity, and behavior of the finished fabric. It's not just about the loops. That's not all that contributes to the forces at play. See, knitting is far more complicated than you give it credit for. The amount of skill and expertise and the depth and breadth of knowledge that people have from sheep to shawl, the entire process, understanding how wool works, understanding that different fibers behave differently, right? Alpaca or cotton are going to behave very differently than sheep wool. Different breeds of sheep wool are going to behave very differently. The physics of the fiber you're using, how you treat that fiber, even before you end up spinning the yarn, way before you end up knitting the garment, all of that matters. You also failed to take into account the process of blocking that knitters understand well. Blocking your knitted fabric changes the way that it behaves significantly.
Knitted materials might not just be keeping us warm, but also protecting packages, absorbing noise, and helping doctors monitor their patients' bodies. And what all this goes to show is that modern science isn't the only way of developing sophisticated technology. Knitting evolved purely through intuition and trial and error, but those knit patterns that emerged from generations of knitters tipped off scientists that there might be something useful here.
A couple of things here. I don't think it's accurate to say that knitting developed through intuition and trial and error, but also you make trial and error sound like it's a negative thing, like it's less than. As somebody whose degree is in biology, most science is done through trial and error, through experimentation. How many scientific discoveries have we stumbled upon by just trying shit and seeing what happens, observing what happens? You said those knitting patterns tipped off scientists that there might be something useful here. I'm not gonna lie, this comment in your video upset a lot of people. You think that knitting in and of itself, the contributions of countless women for centuries of knitting garments, that wasn't already useful? Knitting wasn't just something women did to keep themselves busy, as if women throughout history weren't busy enough. Yes, knitting can be a stim, it can be meditative, but it was about clothing people and keeping them warm and alive. It was an entire industry that fed families, kept farmers in business, and clothed people. I hope you are able to hear the criticisms of knitters in your comment section. This video came off as pretty intensely misogynistic, making it sound like knitting was just some little hobby done by women until physicists got their hands on it. It also strikes me as very classist, like knitting was not useful until people with advanced degrees took it up, harvesting centuries worth of engineering, design, skills, expertise, and tradition from countless women. This video could be so much better. I hope you think about remaking it. And honestly, I hope some knitters and knitting historians make their own versions.